everybody. Thank you so much for joining here at the end of the day, 4 o'clock. Appreciate you coming to hear about research at the end of the day. We know it's a super exciting topic, and so I'm really excited to be here with this awesome panel. I'm Audrey Francisco, head of research at Digital Promise, which is a nonprofit organization that works at the intersection of researchers and educators and product developers. Before I introduce my panelists here, I want to get a little bit of a sense of who's in the audience. So how many in here would identify themselves as sort of an educator, a teacher, a school leader, a district leader? Raise of hands, we'll do this old school. How many folks would say you're kind of an entrepreneur or an investor or something on the ed tech side? Okay. Researchers in the room? Got any researchers? Not too many? And then other sort of nonprofit policy advocacy? Okay. Awesome. So hopefully that gives our panelists a sense of who they're talking to. We got a lot of educators in the room, which is fantastic. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in. And if we have a couple minutes for questions at the end, we'll try to save time for that as well. So Betheny Gross is a senior research analyst and research director at the Center for Reinventing Public Education, and an affiliate faculty at the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington. Dr. Gross oversees CRPE's research initiatives, including their analysis of personalized learning, so we're super excited to have her here today. John Pane is the Distinguished Chair in Education Innovation at RAND Education. He's a senior scientist in their education unit, and he researches implementation and effectiveness of innovations in education with a focus on personalized and competency-based learning. Amelia Peterson is a doctoral candidate in education policy and program evaluation and inequality and social policy fellow at Harvard University. She has also researched personalized learning around the world for LEAP Innovations, as well as Harvard Education's Redesign Lab and Innovation Unit. And finally, Jake Williams is the research coordinator at LEAP Innovations. He's an education researcher who joined LEAP in 2015 as part of their Ed Pioneers program. His work there includes data management and analytics, as well as working to measure the impact of programs such as LEAP's pilot network. Prior to joining LEAP, Jake taught for 6 years at both the elementary and the high school levels. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump right in. And the title of this panel is, But Does It Work? So let's start with what it is. And I'm gonna jump all the way down to Jake here just to do some level setting on the definition of when we say personalized learning. What does that mean for you and for LEAP, and then invite others to add on as well?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Can you hear me all right? Great. Yeah, so we can't really talk about whether or not it's working if we don't know kind of what personalized learning is. And I think it starts before that. We can't necessarily start to implement our programs until we have a defined kind of target in terms of teacher practices and student experiences. So back in 2015, LEAP Innovations developed the LEAP Learning Framework in order to kind of conceptualize what we see as personalized learning. And we break it down into 4 components. One is learner-focused, which is about just student-centered instruction, making sure that we understand our students and that the experiences we're providing for them are based on their individual strengths, needs, and interests. We've also got learner-led, which is about student agency and students having voice and choice in their learning, and being responsible to a certain extent for monitoring their own progress, tracking their metrics. And we've got learner demonstrated, which is kind of about mastery learning and making sure learners can progress at their own pace. And we've got learner connected, which is about making sure that learners and their learning is connected to life outside of school. So what they're learning in school is relevant to what they're learning outside of school, and if they're learning outside of like a regular, brick and mortar building, that they're getting accreditation for that. So for us, this is super important for us to just even start doing our professional development work when we get into our programs, but it's also been really helpful for us in developing our instrumentation for how we measure personalized learning. We have spent, I would say, our first 2 years kind of estimating the impacts of our programs with PL as a little bit of a black box, but now that we're moving forward, we're really excited to have a better understanding of what PL is and be able to measure that so that we can talk about how the different components of it might be affecting student outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Other sort of components of personalized learning that others would like to add?
Well, I think LEAP has done a great job of making a definition. I just wanted to add that there are many ways that schools and teachers are attempting to enact those ideas. And different strategies that they're applying and so forth. And those are all over the map. In a study that we did of personalized learning, which actually predates some of the work that LEAP has done, we found a great diversity of strategies that people were adopting, and they weren't always trying to do everything that Jake mentioned. So when you look at the space, at least as it was 3 or 4 years ago when we were evaluating a group of schools for the Gates Foundation, the practices that were out there were not as coherent as the way Jake described them.
I think it's also really important that it remains a live question, this one of definition, because on the one hand, while we all need to know what we're talking about, and they're having definitions in terms of principles, like those of LEAP, is really useful, when it comes to research and particularly evaluation, you need to have something defined in terms of kind of practices or what it is. But it definitely seems too early to pin that down firmly yet, while everyone's still in what's really a kind of R&D phase. So while we might, at particular moments in time pin down, okay, well, this is what we're going to call it as practices for now so that we can begin to evaluate something, I think it's important that is allowed to continue to evolve as we learn more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the use of the word principles. I think we've got a framework, and sometimes calling that the definition of PL definitely feels strong. And so thinking of it more as guidelines or principles is super helpful. Also because, personalized learning is going to look different at every grade level and in each school, and it would be really hard to have a complete, exhaustive, comprehensive list of all of the different practices and all the different experiences that would define PL.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think you bring up a really good point, Amelia, which is about there needs to be some definition in order to evaluate something, but we're not necessarily there yet. But there is quite a bit of research on some of the components of personalized learning, like feedback at the right time, of agency. Can you all talk, or maybe we'll start with you, Bethany, and go to John, and a little bit about some of those components and what we know about sort of why we think this might be valuable, some of the research behind those.
Well, I should say that I actually done that research. But
You haven't done all the research?
Okay. But the framework that Jake described, and I think a lot of the principles, and this, I think it's a good sort of term to use here, are sort of driven by aspects of learning and what folks have learned about learning in the past, and what the folks who are studying brains are starting to understand about the development of brains and students and their connected learning. So, check your packet. Oh, sure. Can we turn it off? Oh, okay. I'll just speak loudly for right now.
Can you all hear her? Thumbs up in the back?
Yeah. So,
Awesome.
I mean, a lot of the components that Jake was describing, like giving kids opportunity to express their choices and the implications for their ability to develop a sense of agency and to act on that agency, these things are all sort of rooted in various elements of psychology, brain science, and what we've come to know about learning in the past. And I think what personalized learning is doing is trying to kind of put those pieces together into a framework or a theory of learning. But John's you've done more research on just the components of this, especially the software components of it.
Well, we did try to look at that in our research. We had approximately 40 schools in our study, and most of the decisions that are being made about what to implement or what strategies to adopt are at the school level. So unlike things that are happening at the student level where we had a lot of statistical power, we didn't really have the ability to isolate in our study the particular strategies or philosophies about how they were going about doing things in a very quantitative way. We did see a lot of diversity, so I think that until we get to a point where we understand specific strategies' effectiveness, that it is very important to rely on the existing learning science work. And one thing I will say is that when you look very broadly at the widely varying things that people are trying, some of them appear maybe not to have that solid basis. In fact, in some cases, contradict what some of the research says. And so I think that when people are in this time, when we really don't have solid research on specific models, specific strategies that should be assembled together to do this, that it's important to be as aware as possible for each component that you're deciding to implement, to understand what research exists on that and whether it does make sense to include that piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my favorite charts in the RAND studies is you have the effect size across all the schools that you've looked at, right? And it kind of goes from like a pretty large effect size all the way down into a negative. And so I'd love to hear from you and others. I know you're saying you didn't quite have the statistical power to start to understand sort of which implementation variables are leading to that difference in outcomes. But would love to hear about some of the differences that you did see and you did look at, and from others about the kinds of implementation contexts and things that are being done on the ground by schools that seem to be more effective.
Right, so I do think, so the study found on average that personalized learning in these 40 schools was producing positive effects on average. But as Aubrey pointed out, if you look at our estimates for each school, they range from very positive to very large negative effects. And about 1/3 of the schools were producing negative effects. And so the big question is, what's going wrong in those schools? And unfortunately, we don't have good answers to that. But I do think that there are clues in terms of like what kinds of challenges the people were having. And then, for example, teachers were very time pressured. They just felt like they had too much to do or couldn't accomplish what they had set out to do. And that's a clue that there's something that's not working well in terms of the efficient use of teachers' time. So there's things like that. I could elaborate on more of that, but I don't want to monopolize this and give some of our other panelists a chance to weigh in on that.
Yeah, well, I think that point is really important about what we can learn from the learning sciences in general and previous attempts to translate those into practices that are going to be effective. So from the research on feedback over many decades, it was established that feedback was something that had this fantastic impact in education. And then people have tried to design interventions that are specifically to give students more feedback and haven't found the same impacts. So there's obviously some challenges around implementation that just in general, when we're introducing new things, we don't tend to give people enough time to really figure out how to do them well, how it's going to work in their context. The other thing that we found from studies is that any kind of new intervention will interact with the social dynamics in a particular way. So we've had interesting findings coming out about things like, there's a great study where a leaderboard was introduced. Kids were working on a computer, doing their own thing. They introduced a leaderboard, which was meant to kind of gamify everything, incentivize everybody to work harder. And they found that actually it had the opposite effect in that the kids that had previously been high achieving kind of dropped their achievement because they didn't want to be publicly put on this leaderboard because the kind of prevailing social norms in that classroom were that achievement, you didn't want to be an overachiever. So we have to kind of think about how those sorts of social dynamics are going to be interacting with the things we're introducing and potentially producing some of these very diverging impacts we see.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the question isn't like, does it work? It's sort of when does it work, or why does it work, or how does it work, for whom does it actually work, are the questions that we really want to be digging into. Can you talk, I mean, Jake, I know that LEAP does a lot of work in personalized learning. What are some of the obstacles, some of the tensions that you and our other panelists as well can weigh in on what you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, that's a really good, we've got some examples of those. I would say, like, first of all, like, one of the things that, like, LEAP is doing in the implementation of personalized learning is, to a certain extent, we're kind of embracing the variation that is kind of an obstacle for the research. So when we have our school teams join our program and go through our professional development, we're not necessarily explicitly telling them this is what personalized learning needs to look like in your classrooms. Mm-hmm. We're having them start with problems of practice, kind of running through the theory of the framework and what we think PL could look like, and then kind of coming up with a plan for how that could roll out in their schools. So from a research perspective, that's super complicated because you don't have a consistent treatment. So even with all like the fancy stuff with like the virtual control groups or propensity score matching, like you don't necessarily have a consistent treatment, which is problematic. But we do find that kind of like from a meta perspective, there are, no matter what people are doing, there are certain things that are helpful, like teacher buy-in. Like we found that in teams where we can change mindsets and beliefs about the effectiveness of personalized learning, then we can at least get those teachers to progress further in their practice, right? We've got a long way to go to make sure that that can be done consistently, and then to make sure that those specific practices are tied to outcomes. But that's like a good start. In terms of obstacles, I think one of the big ones is kind of taking too big of a bite, right? So like we talked about the framework, and like I think if a pilot team, I'm sorry, I'm using the phrase pilot team as if everyone knows what it is, right? So each of our schools has like 6 to 8 teachers that are trying new practices, and they're a team, and they've got a leader, and they come and they do professional development. Our pilot network program in specific is not a school-wide intervention. But if our pilot team was to try to take our framework and implement it all at once, it would be a recipe for disaster. And so we found, especially with teachers who are kind of reluctant or skeptical about like the intervention, that if they can start with that question and kind of start with something small and then build and iterate off that, that's been successful.
So obstacles is something that I have researched quite a lot. And so I think these, building off of a lot of what Jake said, we've kind of identified 4 really critical issues that have come up across all of the schools that we were looking at. And I should say, first of all, most of the schools that I studied were in school districts, so they were very much kind of like the traditional model. A lot of the personalized learning work and a lot of the sort of formative exploration has been happening in the charter sector with independent schools who kind of have a different set of sort of surrounding sort of environment for them. But the schools I was looking at were, for the vast majority of them were situated in school districts. I would say the first obstacle that surfaces is how complex and how nuanced the goals are. Jake offered a LEAPS framework, and it's it's a very tidy framework. But embedded in that framework are a lot of concepts that are relatively new to our classrooms and to like on the one hand, like the concept of agency is not a new concept to our teachers, but what it means, what it looks like, the connection between their work in the classroom and the child's development of agency, those are all new. That hasn't been what teachers have been doing at a really high level for a long time. And so even when these very nice sort of principles are presented to folks, I think we underappreciated how much time and effort and investment we needed to make in making those abstract goals concrete to educators. The second thing that we noticed across these schools is that, as has already been said, is that this is largely a kind of like still design, innovate space right now. We can't tell people what to do. We kind of have to say, can you go figure this out? In order to be able to do that well, we need, educators kind of need to, and schools and folks in schools need to be able to kind of try something and then kind of systematically assess the extent to which it's working and not, and have it benchmarked against some measures of success and measures of the goals. We didn't actually provide really good measures of a lot of these goals. Like nobody's got great measures of agency operating out there. There are measures of agency that are out there, we just don't see them in schools very often. And again, like our teachers have never been asked to prototype and test things before, and so there's a kind of a skills development that needs to happen there. The third thing that we noticed was that the role of leaders is absolutely pivotal in these schools. Leaders are going to need to play a really important role in kind of opening folks up to give them the freedom and flexibility to experiment, and then also kind of close things down and make decisions about like, no, this isn't, we're not going to let everything go forever. We need to kind of shut down some things that aren't working. We need to start to let this coalesce and cohere. Otherwise, we're going to just have like, this classroom looks like that classroom looks like that, and we don't really have a coherent experience for students. And then finally, like I said, we were all in districts, in school district schools, and the school district central office, on average, is not designed to support this kind of innovation and this kind of exploration in really meaningful ways. You know, the PD office is not designed to support innovation. The PD office is designed to help people implement known practice. You know, the resource mechanisms are not designed to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Resource mechanisms are designed to make sure everybody gets the same thing. So there are many kind of ways in which the sort of the school systems, and of course don't get me started on accountability systems, right? So, you know, there are a lot of different ways in which the system is just not designed to kind of propel this work forward, but instead kind of introduce hurdles and bumps along the way.
Yeah, I want to dig into one of those pieces a little bit, which was actually around the measurement piece that you brought up and the goals and the measurement. And I heard in a former panel earlier today, somebody said, you know, we measure only a fraction of what it takes for a student to be college and career ready. And I think a lot of people would agree part of the goals, while different for every school, is that to graduate students who are college and career ready, and then that's driving some of the interest in personalized learning. So, you know, as researchers, what do you see as the kinds of measurements we either need to develop or figure out how to use more in order to better understand personalized learning? Kind of an open question.
Well, there is a lot of research activity right now on measuring socio-emotional learning skills. And you know, we would have loved to have included a measure like that in our study, but it did not exist at a broad enough application level yet that we could actually take advantage of something like that. But it is very important, given the goals of these programs, to try to measure those things. And you know, I have hopes that in the coming years there will be instruments that will become, you know, sort of stand out in terms of quality and being used.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I mean, absolutely there with the hope. I think I'm still somewhat skeptical about just so many of the measures at the moment are still really reliant on self-reports because it's incredibly burdensome to do anything else. So I think while for research purposes we can absolutely keep investing in that and we can move towards better and better measures, there's also the question of at school level for kind of their own internal development and improvement, I think they're going to have to rely on something other than, well, or at least something additional to measurement. And there are things like guidance and thinking about how you can have more holistic forms of advisory or guidance happening in schools so that that aspect of personalized learning that is about trying to kind of do that more holistic development can happen and can be led by education professionals, because I think that kind of waiting for the measures at the school level is just going to take too long and is always going to be too burdensome for them to be able to use them for their own internal improvement processes.
Yeah, so thinking about that, you know, we've heard now it's experimental, it's sort of design and test and iterate, the need for improvement. Have you seen, you know, examples of schools that you could point to where that's been going on super well, and talk a little bit about how they're doing that work, or what we as a community need to do to support that kind of work as we get to these better measures, as we get to these more rigorous measures that might help us in the future?
An example of a school where I thought they were kind of like overcoming those 4 issues that I laid out. You know, the way it worked there was that you know, first of all, they had the sort of failure to launch, and then the kind of self-reflection. Then the school district invested pretty heavily in building the principal's capacity to understand and execute on change management, sort of core principles of change management. They invested in the leadership straight away. She, you know, as she was getting her own sort of executive training, she brought her staff through a kind of a goals norming period where they weren't trying a lot of stuff in classrooms, but instead they, as a faculty and as a staff, were really sitting down and getting clear on what their goals were going to be as they moved into the sort of shifting their instructional approaches and instructional models. And they actually spent like the better part of a year engaged in that work. And they, you know, so they, talked about it, but then they also codified it locally so that, you know, everybody walks around the school with sort of the vision, the instructional vision that is shared across the school building. And then they started, you know, going for sort of the changes and experimenting and trying out different things. They didn't have any more quality measures available to them than anybody else has. So when they did get to that stage where they were out and kind of like trying things out, they did it in teams of teachers. So they had several different teams, and they kind of work in pods throughout the school. And a pod or a team of teachers would say, you know, we're having this problem. Why don't we try a couple of different things? And this teacher would try, you know, project A, that teacher would try project B, that teacher would try project C. And they had sort of a shared sense of, they had an idea internally and they wrote it down and they said, we'll know that it's working if we actually accomplish this, or if our students are able to do this. So they weren't really using sort of any battery of assessment items, but there were expectations of what they wanted their kids to be able to accomplish. They had a sense of how they would see that, and then they split off, tried things, and then came back, and they talked over what worked, what didn't work, and then then the team of teachers would sort of pick one and say, okay, we're all going to do this because this seemed to work the best. And they kind of had these systems built into their school model. And some of the remarkable things about that staff is that, you know, one thing that we worry about a lot in the context of, you know, schools and innovation is, you know, some schools have actually a ton of turnover in their staff, and you kind of you worry about, you know, losing knowledge base and having it shuffle out of the school. I actually couldn't tell, when I was talking to you, I couldn't tell the difference between a first-year teacher in this school and a fifth-year teacher in this school because they had so much sort of shared expectations. They were able to socialize new teachers to the vision, the goals, how the sort of testing system worked pretty quickly. So that's, you know, I thought that was one of the more remarkable things that I saw.
Yeah, that time for collaboration between teachers, and that also connects back to what Jake was saying earlier about really having buy-in and making that emphasis on buy-in and shared vision and goals early on seems to
And
be
the leadership
important.
component.
And the
which I
leadership
think
component to support that.
Definitely distinct from many of the other places we've visited.
Great. So shifting gears a little bit, we're here at GSV. So we've heard a lot about technology in the last few days. Would be curious, maybe starting, Jake, I know you run this pilot network. A lot of the things you test are technology, software products. Ways in which you see technology sort of supporting personalized learning.
Yeah, so Pilot Network definitely started out as like almost originally being exclusively about the technology. It's like way back in cohort 1. We're starting cohort 5 now, but in cohort 1, we, to a certain extent, you know, through the products over the transom, tried to see like what worked, but we didn't pay close attention to like features or characteristics of the products that might make them successful. We had a kind of a minimal curation process at the time to try and understand what might be a successful product. But that's been built out dramatically since then. And so now we've got, I think, a pretty substantial curation rubric that allows us to kind of go through each product and kind of carefully consider it feature by feature. It's still got a long ways to go, and it's been built off of a lot of work that had already been done. This is not something we just kind of came up with from scratch. But from what we can tell in terms of like looking at products according to these characteristics, and then in our implementations, again, like we haven't been able to connect any of this to outcomes yet, but product data, freeing up teacher time, collaboration, and then like, I kind of want to almost call it the algorithms, but really what I mean is like that more targeted instruction, right? Like the right content at the right time. All of those are big. You know, with data, you know, kind of going back to our first component of learner focus, like if you have more information about your student, then theoretically you should be able to create more targeted instruction. There's a lot of variation in that. Like even in our observations, we're seeing that some teachers are using the product data, you know, very aggressively, sometimes in real time to make decisions with their students. Sometimes they're using it kind of on like a weekly I don't know, basis to set targets for the students who then have to kind of monitor their work throughout the week. But for us, from a research perspective, we've been fighting really hard to kind of push the ed techs to make that data available. A lot of them don't even necessarily have the sensors in place or a conception of what those metrics would be for us as researchers to be able to tell whether or not a teacher is drilling down into any one given student's work. So then we could hypothesize that that teacher is then catering instruction based on the data. Yeah.
Other ways you all have seen technology, support personalized learning in different ways?
I think overall it's just too early to say. When I was doing this literature review for LEAP and trying to look through, there are individual platforms that have very good evaluation results. There are many that do not. And there are many, many meta-analyses that just suggest that while sometimes technology can help, sometimes it doesn't, and we still don't know enough about why it does and why it doesn't, other than just seeing again and again that not enough time goes into implementation, not enough time goes into people really being able to understand what they're being given, and then being able to work with developers for developers to also understand what they really need. And so I think there is still just huge room for improvement there. And so going back to the prior point about really thinking about what kind of these improvement processes would look like and what kinds of circular processes will allow developers and educators to work more closely together to kind of develop things over a period of time. Seems like a huge space for people to move into.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see technology plays a lot of different roles in a personalized learning environment. It can help with sort of keeping track and orchestration. It can help with creation of work, instead of creating a written report, there's lots of different things that can be created. And it can help with that content delivery idea, these adaptive algorithms that deliver the right level of difficulty at the right time. And many folks here have probably walked into a classroom and seen sort of kids kind of plugged into headphones, heads down. And I'm just curious if there are concerns or things that you're seeing as technology enters into the personalized world, learning world, that we need to be aware of.
Well, my research, even beyond personalized learning, has been studying a variety of education technology products that appear to be very promising when they're studied in small laboratory type situations, but don't work well when they are deployed at a wide scale in schools. And even within a line of products from the same company, sometimes one will produce a positive effect in one study and one of their other products produce a negative effect in another study. So that suggests to me that it's more than just the technology, it's how it's used, how much it's used, what the contextual factors are that might be influencing how effective it is. That means there's a lot of work to do to figure out what's going to work in any given situation. And in some ways, it's a very daunting kind of task to figure out how we can evaluate all of the products that are out there in all the different circumstances that they might be able to work, and make decisions about, this one works, this one doesn't, or this one works in this situation and this one works in the other situation. I don't think we have the resources to actually systematically go through all the products and do that kind of testing. So we have to think about, from a research and implementation science kind of point of view, how can we go about this process of figuring out maybe features of products or interplays between product design and situations in the schools that could be very influential in how effective the product will be. I think there's a lot of work to do there, and by trying to think of it more at a higher level, like what are the high-level features of the product, what are the circumstances in this particular site, and like trying to see how those interact and find the ones that work in that way, and then hopefully that can tell us about a class of products that fit a certain design that would work there.
I think, sorry.
We'll start with Amelia.
Well, just as a really important point in that, which I think is that it calls for a research framework that's different from evaluation. Certain pieces of this will get to a point at some point where we can think in terms of evaluation again, but I think there's just a lot of space for thinking in terms of kind of research practice partnerships and being able to understand, okay, well, if there are a number of different products which are maybe necessary but not sufficient components of what an overall more personalized learning system would look like. How can we begin to understand more about those, how those fit together? But if we start evaluating them on their own, they're not going to have impacts because they're necessary but not sufficient. So I think, yeah, it calls for a whole different approach to what kind of research we're looking to do.
I was just going to say that a little bit contradictory to what you said earlier, although I don't necessarily disagree, when you were saying that, technology has there are a lot of different ways we see technology deployed in schools. I'm actually really surprised, and I was really surprised. So we looked at 39 different schools that were, in one manner or another saying they were trying personalized learning. And I was really struck by the relatively narrow range of technology in the school and use of technology in the schools. And that, by and large, and I think this is reflective probably of the marketplace, but by and large, the most frequent and most common use of technology is sort of differentiation content delivery, right? Like this is all about kind of kids' academic competencies. Yeah. The other way you could sort of, I think in terms of the NGLC, they have their My Ways framework, which talks about, okay, kids need to develop academic competencies, they need to develop critical thinking skills, they need to develop sort of those habits of success, and then they need to develop skills that they refer to as wayfinding, but this is basically like goal setting and navigating your life, basically. And so, there's definitely a lot of deployment around academic competencies, and it's all the software, STMath, and IXL, all the things that we've heard about over and over again. There's deployment that is around kind of like helping kids organize, and delivery of data, helping them to kind of get a sense of their progress and things like that, which is all, I think, really helpful for sort of building their capacity around those habits of success. But relatively little deployment around the critical thinking work or definitely the wayfinding. I mean, I'm not a technologist, so I mean, but I can think of kind of 100 different ways technology could be deployed against those two goals, but there's just really not where it's happening in schools right now. And I think it's kind of interesting question to ask, is this a marketplace problem, or is this a sort of awareness problem in the world? And what ways can we start to think about technology supporting teachers in that other work? Because that is a lot of the newest work that we're asking teachers to engage on, but we have the least support to provide to them for that work.
Well, I think one of the things that has been brought up in several different contexts here is this idea of there needs to be a way for these technology developers and educators and researchers to all interact and co-design and do this work together in order to get there. That it doesn't simply work for somebody to develop a tool, like throw it over the fence, and then the educators pick it up and boom, yay, this is great, So I'm curious, I know LEAP's pilot network, and there's other pilot networks out there. Sort of, how might we get there? How do we have more of this collaborative, co-design, research practice partnership type work, or where do you see it happening that we could kind of build on?
I'd happy to take that. I just wanted to kind of second what John had said before, though, about trying to find the products and deconstruct them a little bit into their parts and features. Does this product work? It's the wrong question, right? And it's also, even if you know the answer, it's not a worthwhile answer if you don't know why. And then I think on top of that is just the reality that there are so many products, but also each individual product is going to change over time. If it's not, then the developers aren't doing their jobs. So to say STMath didn't work in 2015, it's 2018, we should be able to give them another shot or something like that. But for LEAP, that's kind of our incentive to the ed techs in order for them to participate in our programs and to offer the schools the free licenses is that feedback channel. So we're talking to our teachers, we're talking to our students all the time about what's working and what's not working, and then that's being reported back to the ed techs. And I would say on the whole, they're pretty responsive. I would say each each of our partners each year will probably get at least like one good nugget or like one good lesson that they can run with. And sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big. But if you can get the incentives in place, it can happen. And there's a lot of room for us to do it better, and we're thinking about how we can do it better, but it's not impossible.
I mean, this is where I would talk about the system again. So Innovate NYC is an example that it's an initiative in the New York City Department of Education to kind of do exactly what you said, sort of bring the developers together with the educators and kind of have the educators put problems on the table, have the developers really work on solving those problems for them. They had to totally upend the procurement process in a school district in order to do this, because it's especially if you think a place like New York City, granted it's a kind of big example, but Chicago is not terribly different. And that the procurement system in a school system is designed to bring in big vendors who have to invest a lot of effort to get their products into a school system, and so it doesn't really lend itself to that, like that small sort of agency or organization to kind of work with and then get their product into a school. It can be done, but it does require an explicit systemic effort to kind of really upend a pretty serious element of a school district, which is that procurement process. I think it's probably why it's one of the elements of the charters that I think they benefit from avoiding.
I think one opening there is a bit of a trend towards more kind of research practice partnerships, which districts are involved in, partnering with either universities or small sub-teams within universities, sometimes states as well, kind of the collaboratives are often on that model. But they're usually focused on kind of existing district or state priorities, and so bringing more of an innovation or technology lens into that I think there's a lot of potential there, because it's at least an opening where people are looking to work in more sort of developmental ways over time.
All right. Well, I think on that sort of forward-looking note, I'll kind of open it up maybe to the audience and questions that you all have.
So everything you've been talking about has been in schools, in established schools. Right? What do we know about models that are outside the traditional school walls? Whether it's home learning or alternative models. How do we know? What do we know about personalized learning outside of that?
So a number of kind of out-of-school, like after-school club type things turned up in my literature review. There have been individual impact studies. The big problem usually is just we don't have the data, because informal programs typically aren't collecting data systematically on what kids are learning. So there are individual impact studies that are, some of them promising. But I think it's a huge gray area. And it's something where if the whole idea of sort of extended learning time and out-of-school learning opportunities is going to continue to be able to grow and develop, I think someone needs to be thinking systematically about how a research agenda would work without that kind of data.
I would second that. We work with a lot of our ed techs, and like a really big question that we have is like, how much are our students using the products outside of school, either under parent supervision or on their own nights or on weekends. And a lot of the ed tech providers, a surprising number, can't quite get us that data. If they could, it would be like sensor level data, like time stamped, and it would be kind of hard for us to work with. So I think like we're still pushing to try and help them develop metrics and help them be able to report out in a way that would potentially answer questions like that.
Question in the back there.
Do you guys have a sort of singular definition of personalized learning? Because it seems to me, and we work with like out of the schools, and it seems to me that everyone has their own little function, depending on the school district you go to. So it could be student-led learning or student ownership or some sort of blended learning, and everyone goes with that, and then you conflate them. Are you explicitly rejecting the definition we gave at the beginning of the talk, or did you walk in late?
Kind of, like, because it seems to me, and in observation of schools and districts, that they do not agree to that definition. And if they are not agreeing to that definition, then it's only meaningless how we step in, because they are not agreeing.
Well, yeah. I think Jake gave a good definition from how I perceive it, but you are right that there is a bit of a backlash from some schools that are doing this to say that they don't even want anybody to try to define it. That, you know, every person or every site is going to do something different, and you know, that's part of the concept to them. I don't think that that's a very productive way to think about advancing things across the country and, you know, getting scientific evidence about it. But there is that stance out there. I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've been discussing is this just like all learners vary, you know, organizations vary too, and schools vary too, and so how do we get to a point where we're understanding, you know, the factors that influence outcomes, like what are the implementation contexts or factors, but it seems we're kind of in this area where we're still in this exploratory phase of like, what are these different things, and how can we relate the strategies that folks are using for personalized learning to outcomes, and then maybe from there will emerge a more like normalized definition across settings, but we're in that space. I don't know if how my panelists might think about that.
I would agree. I think we're not in a place where we can say what personalized learning is. I think we're closer to a place of talking about what personalized learning does. You know, like what it, you know, what we're trying to accomplish with students. Even though I think we're still a little loose there too.
Question up front here.
Yeah, I'm curious. I go to a lot of panels and I've heard enormous enthusiasm for personalized learning, but it seems to me as if there's kind of mixed and not very conclusive research on how it's working. I wondered if any of you who've been looking at it can help us explain the enormous enthusiasm for something so untested.
Well,
I can. You want to go?
I think that there is, first of all, you're right, I think. Your perception is right that we are not offering a wholly enthusiastic view about how well it works right now. But there is a great promise here in terms of having an opportunity because of the supportive technology to change the way schools work. And that is coming at a time when we have persistent disappointment with how things have been going, particularly for kids who start out underprivileged and behind in school and never catch up. And ideas about how we might be able to fix that. At the same time, there's a bit of dissatisfaction with some of the large amount of testing and the accountability systems and things that have come up over the past 10 or 15 years since NCLB, which have many merits, but also have, you know, produced over-testing and dissatisfaction with the amount of testing and so forth. So I think it's coming at a time when people are seeing opportunity to make a change that has the potential to make a big difference. And in my mind, it's centered around this mastery learning idea, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be worked out to actually make this work within our existing systems with all of the infrastructure that's currently in place. In some ways can inhibit it. We didn't get a lot of chance to talk about things like how standards and assessment can inhibit personalized learning, but that is a problem right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, like, I think that to John's point, like, there's the convergence of, like, this, what I think a lot of the educators that I talk to sort of describe as, like, coming out of this horrible fog of the standards-based, evaluation-based, test-based reform period into this time where we're asking teachers to re-examine their craft, put on the table a lot of these goals and around the social emotional development of kids on the table and on equal footing with academic. This is very appealing to sort of the native nurturing instinct of a lot of our educators. And, you know, what we hear from them is that, you know, they'll say things to us like, this is why I got into teaching, to be able to do this for my students. Like, even as they struggle to actually do it, even as they like are up way too late at night trying to figure out how to rewrite their lessons, they're still saying, this is why I got into education. And I think that's a very powerful motivation. And, you know, I hope that we can start to bring together the supports and understand what it takes to actually fulfill this ideal, because we do not want to squander this level of enthusiasm from our educators.
I would just add to that I think it's important to make a distinction between what we have evidence for in terms of there's kind of strong empirical evidence from a range of different research traditions in kind of psychological and cognitive sciences, and some observation studies as well, that when kids are able to work on things that are kind of matched with what they can know and can do already, they make more progress. But that's very different from saying, and we have been able to implement ways of doing that at scale and have evaluated them and have found good impacts. You know, we're not quite at that second one, but I think there is a good range of research from many different kinds of traditions that suggests that that's a good direction to be trying to move in.
And I think we'll kind of end there, and I'm sure our panelists will answer some follow-up questions, but we'll sort of end on that powerful note of there's promise and there's enthusiasm, and there are a lot more questions to be asked and answered. So please join me in thanking our panelists.